Dinner at my in-laws' house was usually uncomfortable, but that night was on another level. My sister-in-law, who had been away for quite some time, finally came home and joined us at the table. The dining room was filled with the smell of roasted meat and sautéed vegetables, and everything was set out nicely in front of us. I watched quietly as my mother-in-law, father-in-law, and sister-in-law picked up their utensils and dug into the meal. I hadn't touched my plate. Suddenly, my sister-in-law looked at me. Her fork paused in midair, and she stared. "Aren't you going to eat anything?" she asked. Without thinking, I smiled faintly and answered, "No, I'm the wife. The leftovers will be sufficient for me." She blinked. "Isn't that correct?" my mother-in-law chimed in, as if that settled everything. My sister-in-law stared in disbelief. Her eyes darted from me to her mother. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law was too busy chewing to even glance up. That moment stayed with me. It was the night my sister-in-law started seeing her mother in a very different light. My name is Stokes Twin. I'm a stay-at-home mom with a part-time job, managing the house and raising our child. My husband travels a lot for work, which means most days I'm alone juggling everything. But I never really complained. We love each other, and he works hard to make sure we live comfortably. Still, one person has always been a thorn in my side: my mother-in-law. She lives just a short walk away. That proximity has always been more of a curse than a blessing. She calls me constantly. Sometimes early in the morning, sometimes right when I'm about to nap, other times when I'm in the middle of feeding my baby. Her demands vary, from asking me to do her laundry, to pulling weeds in her yard, or even picking up cakes from a new bakery near the station. She treats me like her personal maid. Once or twice, I wouldn't have minded, but she calls multiple times a day, every single day. And it's not like she's physically incapable. She's in perfectly fine health, apart from her weight. But she can walk, talk, move. She's just lazy. Or maybe entitled. Probably both. At her house, I'm not treated like family. I'm treated like hired help. My father-in-law, to his credit, has always been kind to me, but he doesn't see how she treats me behind closed doors. She never calls me when he's home, only when he's out. When I told my husband, he promised to talk to her. He did. He warned her more than once, but each time she flipped the narrative. "She promised to help me," she'd say. Then she changes her mind and makes me look bad. She'd cry. She'd claim I hated her, that I was cruel, and that she was the real victim. After a few of those performances, I stopped bringing it up to my husband. I didn't want to burden him. He was working so hard. I thought maybe it was better to deal with it on my own. Maybe that's what she wanted, to isolate me. Either way, I felt like I had no one to talk to. I just endured it. But things only got worse. One morning, she called me to clean her garden. Not just sweep or trim. She wanted me to cut thick branches from the trees, gather them all, and clean up the debris. I was out there for hours. The sun was blazing, sweat dripped into my eyes, my arms ached. Still, I kept going. When I finally stepped back inside, it was well past noon. My mother-in-law was sprawled on the couch in the living room, watching TV and eating chocolates. The floor was littered with empty wrappers. "I'm hungry," she said without looking away from the screen. "Make something for me. Whatever's in the fridge will do." I trudged into the kitchen. There was a mountain of unwashed dishes in the sink. "You'd better get started," she added lazily. "My friends are coming over tonight, and I want the place spotless. No time to dither." I looked at her, exhausted and hungry, and asked if she could at least help a little. She didn't even respond. She just stared at the television, pretending I didn't exist. I bit my tongue. I cleaned the kitchen, washed the dishes, and made fried rice. Simple, easy. I plated it nicely, 2 servings, and set it on the table. "Fried rice again?" she scoffed. "Can't you come up with anything better?" But she ate it anyway. She even looked satisfied. I sat down to finally eat. But before I could take my first bite, I checked my phone. I had been hoping for a message from my husband. When I looked up again, my plate was gone. My mother-in-law was already devouring my portion. Her plate? Empty. "That was my food," I said, my voice trembling. She shrugged. "I'm still hungry. You should have made more." "But I made 2 plates, one for you and one for me." "You're just the wife. You should know better. The wife eats after the family, that's basic. But you can't even get that right." She licked the spoon and didn't stop until every grain of rice was gone. I stood there stunned, empty-handed, with nothing left on the table. "Now clean up," she ordered. "My friends will be here any minute." Then she waddled back to the couch, ripped open a new bag of chips, and dropped crumbs all over the carpet. As I vacuumed the floor, I couldn't help but imagine the machine as her. sucking up not just the crumbs, but every bit of my patience, my energy, my dignity. My stomach growled, but I swallowed water to keep the hunger away. I told myself right then and there I was done. I wouldn't help her anymore, not ever. I didn't care how much she begged, guilt-tripped, or cried. If she wanted a maid, she could hire one. I was done, or so I thought. Just a few days later, everything changed. My father-in-law collapsed at work. He was hospitalized and diagnosed with partial paralysis on his right side. He could still use the bathroom and do a few things, but he needed constant assistance with meals and bathing. Despite everything, I cared about him. He had always been decent to me, kind even. So I grabbed my coat and rushed out, determined to help. Right as I stepped out the door, my phone rang. It was her. "You wicked wife. When were you going to show up? Don't you care at all about your father-in-law? You're so ungrateful." I tried to tell her I was already on my way, that I didn't need to be told to come, but she kept screaming, so I hung up. I didn't need the drama, not now. I started caring for my father-in-law the next day. Every morning, I dropped my child off at daycare and headed straight to their house. I cooked his breakfast, washed his clothes and bedsheets, cleaned the floors, made lunch, bathed him. It was exhausting, but I didn't mind. Not for him. He was appreciative, gentle, and grateful. That made it easier. But of course she had to ruin it. She kept criticizing everything I did. "This food is bland," she'd complain. "Why not make something normal?" "It's not for you," I replied calmly. "It's for Dad. He needs soft, nutritious meals. You can make your own food." She glared at me. "How dare you speak to me like that? Do I need to remind you I can leave any time I want? I don't care what happens to him. If I walk out, it'll be your problem." And she was right. Every care facility nearby was full. Wait lists stretched for months. I couldn't afford to care for him alone 24/7. So I swallowed my pride and cooked for her too. She ate, of course, and then handed me a plate of scraps. "Here are your leftovers," she said, stretching out on the couch again. In the pan, there was barely anything left. Just a few limp noodles and some soggy cabbage. I ate them on a small plate, pretending they'd fill me. They didn't. I pulled out a sandwich I had packed from home and finished folding the laundry. Later, I checked on my father-in-law. He looked at me with tears in his eyes. "I'm so sorry," he whispered. "He must have heard it all." "It's not your fault," I said gently. "You've always been kind, like a father to me. I'm here for you. Please don't blame yourself." He nodded, grateful, but the shame in his eyes was heartbreaking. That evening, I got a call from my sister-in-law. "I'm sorry, Stokes," she said. "I should come home to care for our father. You shouldn't be doing this alone." She had heard what happened. I assured her that I was okay, that I was just doing what he would have done for me. But she hesitated. "My mother," she began, "she can be difficult. You've had a rough day, haven't you?" There was a pause. Then she said something that gave me hope. "I'll be returning home at the end of the year. You won't have to deal with this much longer." Her words lingered in my mind for the rest of that night. "You won't have to deal with this much longer." They echoed through the quiet halls of my own home as I tucked my child into bed, wiped down the counters, and folded laundry in silence. It was the first time in months someone acknowledged what I was going through. I didn't realize how desperately I needed to hear it. My sister-in-law wasn't just anyone. She was the only other person who truly understood what it meant to live under the same roof or shadow of my mother-in-law. And now, after so many years of distance, she was finally coming back. Until then, nothing changed. In fact, things got worse. As the year came closer to its end, my mother-in-law's demands became more and more relentless. She had a checklist in her mind of everything she needed me to do, and she never asked politely. She ordered, she barked, "Scrub the kitchen floor, it's filthy. Clean the exhaust fan. Take down the curtains and wash them. Why haven't you wiped the windows yet?" She didn't once consider that I had a house of my own to take care of. My own home became an afterthought, a place I crashed at night after working a full unpaid shift at hers. My life outside of her world didn't seem to exist to her. I was invisible unless I was useful. That's how she liked it. New Year's Eve was around the corner, and as expected, she dumped even more tasks on my plate. Cooking, cleaning, prepping everything for the holiday. She expected me to handle it all. There was just one problem. I didn't have the time. With the childcare drop-offs, my part-time job, taking care of my father-in-law, and my own family's needs, preparing an entire traditional meal for New Year's Eve wasn't something I could realistically do. So, I talked to my husband, and we decided to order the meal from a reputable service. It would save time and stress, and we could still enjoy good food as a family. Big mistake. The second my mother-in-law found out, she lost it. "What a waste of money!" she shouted. "If you're going to be someone's wife, you should at least know how to cook. What good are you if you can't even prepare one simple meal for the family?" I wanted to scream back at her, "You're a wife too. What are you good for besides criticizing everyone else?" But I didn't. I held it in. I didn't want my father-in-law to hear us arguing. He'd been through enough. To calm the storm, I promised her I'd make the meal myself. I stayed up late every night preparing bit by bit, chopping vegetables, marinating meat, and trying to make something that wouldn't give her an excuse to belittle me. Then New Year's Eve arrived. The house was buzzing with tension. My sister-in-law arrived just before dinner. She was alone. No hugs, no greetings. My mother-in-law took one look at her and launched her usual attack. She never missed an opportunity to hurt her own daughter. "It's your first time home in years, and still you have nothing to show for it. Alone again, are you? Where's that pathetic husband of yours? Did he finally divorce you? Or did you scare him off with that mouth of yours?" She laughed, a cold, heartless laugh. But my sister-in-law didn't flinch. She simply replied, calmly and clearly, "I didn't bring my husband because I couldn't stand the thought of you treating him the way you treat everyone else." Then she walked straight into our father's room without another word. I stood there stunned and, if I'm being honest, a little bit in awe. She didn't shout. She didn't cry. She didn't beg. She just spoke the truth and left the room. That's when I realized I wasn't alone anymore. Not really. Dinner that evening was more awkward than festive. The food was the only bright spot on the table. I had done my best to prepare a nice meal, and in terms of flavor and presentation, it was solid. But the people eating it? Cold, tense, silent. My husband wasn't there. He had to attend his company's end-of-the-year party, and honestly, I missed his presence more than ever. He always had this ability to bring lightness to a room, to keep the peace, even when everything was on the verge of falling apart. But that night, he wasn't with us, and the weight of it all sat heavily on my chest. I served my father-in-law first. Then my mother-in-law grabbed her plate and started devouring the boiled meat with ferocity. My sister-in-law sat quietly, her expression unreadable. I sat down too, just to be present. But there was no plate for me. No utensils, no spot at the table, really. Just an empty chair next to my father-in-law. My sister-in-law must have noticed. "Stokes, why aren't you eating?" she asked gently. I smiled, that same hollow smile I'd mastered over the years. "Don't worry about me. I'm the wife, remember? Wives eat what's left after the family's finished." My mother-in-law, chewing noisily, nodded in agreement. "Right you are," she mumbled with her mouth full. The pain in my stomach wasn't just from hunger. It was from the quiet acceptance I'd forced myself into, day after day, year after year. I tried to mask my bitterness with a little sarcasm. "You're a wife, too. Why are you eating now? The family isn't finished yet." The room froze. Before my mother-in-law could say anything, my sister-in-law stood up. "Mama better enjoy eating meat while she still can," she said, "because if she gets kicked out of this house, she won't be able to afford any of it." Then she pulled out a folder, a slim packet of papers, legal papers, divorce papers. My eyes widened, my breath caught in my throat. My father-in-law looked up and met his daughter's eyes. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. It was all there in the silence. My mother-in-law's fork fell onto the plate. Her hands trembled. "You can't be serious," she muttered. "We are," my sister-in-law replied firmly. "Father's divorcing you. He's done. He's already been accepted into a lovely care facility. He's selling the house and moving out." "You dare try this with me? You'll regret it," my mother-in-law roared, standing up so fast her chair screeched against the floor. "I'll take you all to court. You'll pay me alimony, every last cent." My sister-in-law didn't even blink. "Feel free. We're ready. We've documented every incident of verbal abuse, neglect, and emotional cruelty you've dished out, toward your husband, toward me, and especially toward Stokes. You want a court case? Let's go." For a moment, it looked like my mother-in-law might explode, but then something shifted in her face. The mention of court was her undoing. She knew she wouldn't win. Her tone changed instantly. "I'm sorry," she whimpered, falling to her knees. "I didn't mean any of it. Please, don't do this. I'll change." But none of us believed her, not anymore. She kept begging, but the room remained silent. Even my father-in-law didn't speak. He just stared at her, tired and worn out, but resolute. "You should sign the papers," my sister-in-law finally said, her voice cool. "Then pack your things and go." That was it. Years of hurt, of manipulation, of torment, finally faced with consequences. My mother-in-law would be out of the house by the end of the week, and we would be free. But that wasn't the end. In the weeks that followed, everything came out. Turns out she hadn't just been cruel to me. She had been verbally and emotionally abusing my father-in-law for years. She constantly told him he was worthless, especially after his health declined. He kept track of everything, every insult, every moment she screamed at him, every time she made him feel like less than human. With my sister-in-law's help, he compiled the evidence, and their case held strong in court. They didn't drag it out. The settlement was reached quietly. She walked away with just a small share of the property and no alimony. The house was sold. And my mother-in-law? She ended up in a rundown apartment. No family, no friends, working part-time to make ends meet. The fancy clothes, the chocolates, the cakes, gone. She lost weight, yes, but she lost everything else too. My father-in-law now lives in a beautiful nursing facility. It's run by a close friend of my sister-in-law, and they treat him with care and dignity. He's surrounded by people who respect him. He's made new friends, he smiles, he laughs. He's even regained some movement in his right side. And I visit him once a week. It's something I genuinely look forward to. The best part? My sister-in-law and I have grown incredibly close. We talk often, check in on each other, and work together to make sure our father-in-law has everything he needs. For the first time in a long time, life feels peaceful, and we're determined to keep it that way. After the dust settled, I found myself standing in the middle of a quieter house. There was no shouting from across the hallway, no unexpected demands from the living room, no sound of wrappers being torn open while I scrubbed the floor with an empty stomach. For the first time in what felt like forever, the silence didn't feel oppressive. It felt like peace. My sister-in-law, who had once been a stranger in my life, now felt like my closest friend. Funny how shared pain can bind people together. We had both been pulled into the same storm. We both knew what it was like to stand on the receiving end of our mother-in-law's cruelty. But now, we were standing on the other side of it. Finally. Even so, the transition wasn't completely easy. There were days I'd walk into my father-in-law's room with his food and instinctively brace myself for a cruel comment from the next room. But none came, just the gentle hum of the heater and the occasional chirp of birds outside the window. He was doing better every week. His physical therapist visited regularly, and he worked hard during every session. I remember one morning I walked in to find him folding laundry. His right hand still trembled, but the fact that he was trying melted my heart. "I'm getting stronger," he said, his smile lighting up his face. "Soon I'll be able to dance." I laughed. "Well, you'd better save a dance for me then." He chuckled, and for once it felt like the laughter came from somewhere deep within. He wasn't just trying to seem happy, he actually was. At the care facility, the staff adored him. Apparently, he told them jokes and stories during meals. He helped other residents write letters to their families. One even said he reminded them of their own father. He had gone from being dismissed and degraded in his own home to being loved and respected by people who barely knew him, all because they treated him like a human being. Sometimes I would think about my mother-in-law, not because I missed her, but because I didn't. That might sound harsh, but it's true. I didn't miss her criticism. I didn't miss the hunger or the loneliness I felt in her presence. I didn't miss feeling like a failure every time I entered her house. What I did feel was curiosity. How had someone so cruel, so manipulative ended up that way? I asked my sister-in-law one evening as we cleaned the kitchen together. "Was she always like that?" I asked. "Even when you were kids?" She was quiet for a while, then she spoke. She wasn't as loud back then, but she was distant, cold. Everything had to be her way, and if it wasn't, you'd pay for it. Dad tried to keep things calm, but she always found something to complain about. "Did she ever hit you?" I asked carefully. "No," she said, but she didn't have to. Her words were worse. She knew exactly how to make you feel small. We didn't talk about it much after that. Some wounds don't need to be reopened. But it helped to know that I wasn't imagining things, that the pain I felt for years was real, valid. After my mother-in-law left, we had to go through the process of packing her belongings. My sister-in-law and I handled most of it. We didn't want our father-in-law to relive anything. He had already endured enough. The house felt lighter with every box we sealed, like each bag of clothes, each drawer emptied, carried away some of the weight that had been pressing on all of us. We didn't talk much during those moments. We didn't need to. There was one drawer, though, that gave us pause. Inside, we found an old photo album. Dusty, neglected. We sat down on the floor, flipping through it slowly. Pictures of my sister-in-law as a child, smiling shyly in a school uniform. My husband as a baby, chubby cheeks and a wide grin. My mother-in-law, looking different, softer, happier. "She used to smile like that?" I asked in disbelief. "Only for pictures," my sister-in-law said with a sad smile. We stared at a photo of her and her husband on their wedding day. She looked young, hopeful even. "It's hard to believe she became the woman we knew," I said. "Maybe she never changed," she replied. "Maybe we just finally saw her clearly." We closed the album and tucked it away in a donation box. There was no need to hold on to memories that weren't ours. Weeks passed. Winter slowly faded into early spring. The house was quieter, yes, but it also felt more alive. My father-in-law had taken up sketching in the afternoons. He wasn't very good at it, he'd admit, but that wasn't the point. It gave him joy, purpose. One afternoon, I brought my child over to visit him. He lit up the moment we walked in. "There's my little troublemaker," he said with a big grin. My child ran to him, hugging his leg tightly. "Want to draw with me?" he asked, holding up a blank sheet of paper. They spent the next hour doodling suns, stick figures, and wobbly hearts. Watching them together made me feel something I hadn't felt in a long time, hope. It was a reminder that healing doesn't always come in grand gestures. Sometimes it's in small, quiet moments. A shared snack, a smile, a crayon drawing. My sister-in-law started staying over more often, too. Sometimes she'd crash on the couch with a blanket and a book. Other nights, we'd sit together after my child had gone to sleep and talk about everything and nothing. One night, as we sipped tea, she turned to me and said, "Thank you." I looked at her, confused. "For what?" "For not giving up," she said. "On Dad, on yourself, on this family. If you hadn't stayed and helped, I don't know what would have happened." I was quiet for a moment, then whispered, "I almost did." She nodded. "But you didn't." We clinked our mugs together in silent agreement. A few days later, I received a letter in the mail. No return address. No name on the envelope. Inside was a simple note, handwritten in shaky script. "I'm sorry." That was it. It took me a minute, but I realized who it was from. My mother-in-law. I showed it to my sister-in-law. She didn't say anything at first, just stared at it. "What do you think?" I asked. "I think," she paused, "she's lonely." "Do you want to reply?" "No." And that was the end of it. We didn't owe her anything. Not after what she put us through. But in that small gesture, I saw something I hadn't expected. Regret, maybe even guilt. But it was too little, too late. Forgiveness, I realized, doesn't always mean reconciliation. Sometimes it just means letting go of the power someone held over you. And that's exactly what we were doing. Letting go. And leaning into something better. That spring, my father-in-law took his first unassisted steps across the living room. We clapped, we cheered, he cried. It was a beautiful moment, one that felt like a turning point. We celebrated with ice cream and music. My child danced around the coffee table. My sister-in-law sang along to old songs on the radio. I watched them both, heart full. For the first time, this house, this home, felt like it belonged to us. To the people who loved, who endured, who survived, and who were finally ready to thrive. Spring came fully into bloom. The air was warmer, the sun stayed out longer, and flowers started appearing along the streets I used to walk alone, back when every step felt heavy. But now, those same walks felt different. Lighter. I could breathe again, not just out of necessity, but because I wanted to. Peace had returned to my life, and this time, it wasn't temporary. My routine hadn't changed much. I still got up early, packed lunch for my child, checked in on my part-time work, and visited my father-in-law. But the weight behind each task had shifted. I no longer felt like I was surviving the day. I was actually living it. My father-in-law's progress was nothing short of miraculous. Every week he grew stronger, physically and emotionally. He was moving more independently. His laughter returned, not as a polite chuckle, but as the real kind, the kind that comes from deep in your belly. He even made a new group of friends at the care facility, mostly people around his age, all with their own stories of hardship and healing. "He's charming the whole floor," one of the nurses joked to me one day. "We're all convinced he's going to start a book club." I smiled. I'd read it. We both laughed, and I walked out that day feeling proud. Proud of him, proud of us. My sister-in-law and I continued working together like a team. She began helping more regularly with errands and check-ins, and her presence became a comfort I hadn't known I needed. We had built something rare between us, trust, respect, and above all, understanding. And it wasn't just built on shared pain, it was built on choosing each other in the aftermath. One day, after a grocery run, we sat together on a bench outside the care home, drinking iced tea. "You know," she said, glancing at the entrance, "Dad talks about you all the time. He says you saved him." I looked down, embarrassed. "I didn't do anything special." "You stayed," she said. "That's everything." Her words warmed me more than the sun on my face. We both knew what staying had cost me, but we also knew what it had brought us. A second chance. A family finally built on love, not fear. My husband noticed the change too. After all the arguments, the silences, and the missed connections during the hardest months, we were finally reconnecting. With his mother out of the picture, he saw things more clearly. We had long conversations after our child went to bed, real conversations, without blame or defensiveness. "I should have done more," he admitted one night. "I should have seen it sooner." "You couldn't," I told him. She was good at hiding it. Still, his guilt hung in the air. I didn't want him to carry it forever, but I understood why it lingered. After all, it wasn't just me who had been manipulated. It was him, too. We were all trapped in her web, and it took time to untangle ourselves. That same week, my child brought home a school assignment. "Draw your family," it said. I smiled when I saw the crayon picture. There we were, me, my husband, our child, and surprisingly, my father-in-law. He was holding a balloon in the picture, smiling bigger than all of us. It made me tear up. He was a part of our family in every sense of the word, not just by name or tradition, but by love. Later that month, we celebrated his birthday at the care home. He turned 75, and we threw him a small party with balloons, homemade cake, and music from his favorite jazz albums. He beamed the entire time. He made a short speech after blowing out his candles. "This year," he said, "has been the hardest of my life, and the best. I've learned that even when everything feels broken, people can put you back together, not by fixing you, but by loving you." There wasn't a dry eye in the room. He looked at me, at my sister-in-law, at our child, and smiled. "I'm lucky to be here, but I'm even luckier to be loved." That night, I walked home with a full heart. But of course, life is never just light. Shadows find their way in. A few weeks after the party, we received word that my mother-in-law had been hospitalized. Nothing serious, but enough to get her checked in. Malnutrition, some fatigue, possibly early signs of a deficiency-related illness. The news hit me strangely, not with joy, not with satisfaction, but with a strange, muted sadness. Not because I wanted her back in our lives, I didn't, but because I knew, deep down, that this was the natural result of a life lived on bitterness. She had pushed everyone away, even those who tried to love her. And now she was alone. I told my sister-in-law the next day. She paused for a moment, then said, "Let's send her some food, not because she deserves it, but because we deserve to be the kind of people who do the right thing." So we did. We ordered a simple, healthy meal delivery, enough for a few days, and sent it anonymously. She never knew it came from us. And that's how it ended, quietly, with us moving forward while she stayed behind. Summer came around, and with it, fresh energy. My father-in-law started sketching more frequently, and my sister-in-law encouraged him to display some of his pieces in the community center. I helped him pick out frames. They weren't masterpieces, but they were heartfelt. His lines weren't perfect, but they carried emotion, stories, history. People loved them. One of the sketches was of our backyard, my child chasing butterflies while I hung clothes on the line. It wasn't overly detailed, but the feeling it gave me was everything. "I want to remember that day forever," he said when I asked him why he drew it. "You will," I replied. Time moved steadily. My part-time job grew into something more stable. My husband's work eased up, giving him more time with the family. My child started piano lessons and brought home messy songs that filled the house with chaos and joy. One afternoon, I stood by the window and watched the wind rustle the trees, and I realized something. For the first time in years, I wasn't waiting for the other shoe to drop. I wasn't tense, bracing for the next insult, the next demand, the next manipulation. I wasn't shrinking myself to fit into someone else's idea of what I should be. I was just me. Stokes' twin, a woman who had survived emotional abuse, who had protected her child, who had stood up for someone who once stood up for her, who had found her strength, not through anger, but through grace, through patience, through choosing love over hate again and again. People sometimes ask if I'd ever forgive my mother-in-law. I think about that often. I think forgiveness is a tricky thing. It's not forgetting. It's not excusing. It's not pretending the pain wasn't real. Forgiveness for me is this. It's waking up each day and choosing not to let her words define me. It's choosing to laugh with my family instead of reliving past wounds. It's finding peace without needing revenge. And it's holding on to the good people in my life. My father-in-law, my sister-in-law, my husband, my child, and treasuring what we've built together. A new chapter, a new family. Stronger than before, kinder, wiser. We don't speak of her much these days, not because we've buried the past, but because we've grown beyond it. Every so often I visit my father-in-law and bring him his favorite tea. We sit on the bench outside the care home, the same one where my sister-in-law and I once talked about healing. Sometimes we don't even say much. We just watch the world go by, peacefully.